I was about to knock on my parents' door when I heard them tell my brother, "Don't worry about the debt. We'll make your sister pay. She'll never say no to family." I didn't knock. I didn't argue. I quietly walked away and transferred all my savings. What they didn't know was, I'd been the one keeping their world spinning for 10 years, and I just hit the stop button. Have you ever felt like the invisible one in your own family? Drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I'd love to know who's part of our community. I didn't slam the front door. Slams are for people who are losing control, people who want to be heard. I wanted the opposite. I wanted to be a ghost. I walked down the gravel driveway, the sound of the stones crunching under my heels, the only evidence I had ever been there. The air was thick with the scent of mown grass and the lingering humidity of a suburban summer, but inside my chest, everything had gone sub-zero. I climbed into my car and sat in the darkness for a moment. The interior smelled of expensive leather, and the faint, sharp scent of my own perfume reminders of the life I had built with zero help from the people inside that house. My hands were steady as I reached for my laptop bag in the passenger seat. There was no racing pulse, no stinging behind my eyes. I felt a strange, crystalline clarity. It was the same feeling I got right before closing a massive acquisition deal. It was the feeling of a predator who had just realized the prey was in the room. I flipped the laptop open. The blue light washed over my face, illuminating the dashboard. I didn't need to think. I didn't need to weigh the pros and cons. I had been the silent investor in the entity known as the Miller family for over a decade. I had funded the growth, covered the losses, and provided the bailouts. But a silent investor always has the right to withdraw their capital when the management turns out to be fraudulent. I logged into the primary management portal for our shared accounts. My parents had always been technologically challenged when it came to anything more complex than a social media post, so they had given me full administrative privileges years ago. I was the one who moved the money, paid the property taxes, and kept the lights on. Michael was listed as a secondary user on the emergency fund, the fund I had seeded with $50,000 of my own money for family crises. I watched the cursor hover over his name. He was currently using that account to pay for his club memberships and gas for a car he couldn't afford. I clicked Revoke Access. A small notification popped up. User Michael Miller has been removed. Access denied. Next, I initiated the migration. I had $240,000 sitting in various high-yield accounts that were technically linked to the family trust for tax purposes, a trust I had built. I began the transfer to my private offshore account in Singapore. $240,000. It wasn't just a number. It was 10 years of 80-hour work weeks. It was the price of every birthday I spent at my desk, and every Christmas I spent answering emails while they drank wine and laughed in the other room. I watched the progress bar crawl across the screen. My compassion had been a luxury they'd overdrafted for years, and tonight, the bank was closed. This wasn't a meltdown. This was a liquidation of a toxic asset. By the time the clock on my dashboard flipped to 12:03 a.m., the Miller family's primary source of oxygen had been cut off. I closed the laptop with a soft click. In the rearview mirror, the lights of my parents' house looked small and fragile. They were still in there, probably still laughing, still planning how to spend my $360,000 bonus to save a son who didn't want to be saved. They didn't know the walls had already fallen. Inside my car, the silence was absolute. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever heard. People tell you that family is a circle, a bond that can't be broken. But for me, family was always a ledger, and I was the only one ever making deposits. As I drove away from that house, I could still smell my mother's perfume lingering on my jacket from the brief hug she'd given me when I arrived. It was a specific scent, vanilla and something sharp. Almost metallic. I used to call it her apology scent. She only wore it when she was about to ask for something she knew I shouldn't have to give. I remember 3 years ago, sitting at my kitchen table with a stack of Michael's past due tuition notices, $18,000 a semester. My father had called me, his voice thick with a performative kind of grief, telling me Michael was struggling and that the family name was at stake. I was working 80 hours a week as a junior associate then, living on caffeine and sheer willpower. I paid it. I paid for his books, his rent, and the car he eventually crashed. When I brought it up at Thanksgiving, Sarah didn't thank me. She just patted my hand and said, "Michael is very sensitive about his failures, Ashley. Don't make him feel small by talking about money. You're so successful. You don't understand how hard it is for him." That was the moment I realized I wasn't a daughter to them. I was a subscription service. I was a high-limit credit line they used to fund Michael's mediocrity. There's a specific kind of psychology that traps people like me. I call it the observant child logic. In toxic families, there are two roles: the golden child who can do no wrong, and the observant child who learns to be perfect just to stay safe. I wasn't high-achieving because I was naturally gifted. I was high-achieving because I learned early on that my value in that house was strictly tied to what I could provide. Excellence wasn't a choice. It was a survival strategy. If I was the smartest, the richest, and the most reliable, then maybe, just maybe, I'd be immune to their chaos. I thought that if I generated enough value, I would finally be seen as a person instead of a resource. But that's the trap of the observant child. You spend your life building a shield of success, only to realize that your family is just using that shield to hide from their own responsibilities. The weight of the steering wheel felt solid in my hands. For years, I had been the silent investor in their version of a happy family, footing the bill for a dream I wasn't allowed to live in. I had paid for Michael's mistakes with my time, my youth, and my peace of mind. I had been a safety net for people who didn't even care if I hit the ground myself. This wasn't an overreaction. This wasn't a family tiff that would be settled over a Sunday brunch. This was a total liquidation. My compassion had been a luxury they'd overdrafted for 29 years, and tonight the account was closed. I wasn't just leaving a house. I was ending a contract that had been forged in my own blood and sweat. The observant child was done watching. She was starting to act. And by the time the sun came up, the Miller family would realize that when you lose your only source of value, you're left with nothing but the debt you've spent a lifetime accruing. The silence lasted exactly 48 hours. I spent that time in a state of high-functioning detachment, finalizing my visa paperwork and organizing the shipping for my few remaining personal belongings. I didn't check the family group chat. I didn't look at Michael's social media. I was a closed system, operating on logic and efficiency. Then, at exactly 2:15 p.m., on Tuesday, my phone vibrated. It was my mother. I let it ring 3 times before I answered. I didn't say hello. I just waited. "Ashley? Honey? Thank God you picked up." Sarah's voice came through the speaker, already pitched in that frantic, breathless tone she used whenever she was about to manufacture a crisis. "Everything is falling apart. The heavy rains last night. The roof in the east wing has a massive leak. The contractor just left, and he says the structural damage is catastrophic. We need $36,000 by Friday to start the repairs, or the whole ceiling might come down." It was a classic opening move. High stakes, a ticking clock, and a clear financial requirement. In the past, this was the point where my observant child programming would kick in. I would have felt the familiar surge of panic and the immediate urge to solve the problem so they could be at peace. But this time, I just looked at the rainfall data for their zip code on my second monitor. It hadn't rained in 4 days. "Send me the contractor's itemized invoice and the structural engineer's report," I said. My voice was flat, the same tone I used when a vendor tried to overcharge me for server space. The silence on the other end was heavy. I could almost hear the gears grinding as she realized her standard script wasn't working. "Ashley, don't be like that. We're family. Why are you acting like a bank teller? Your father is devastated. He's up there right now with buckets, trying to save the furniture." "I'm not acting like a bank teller, Mom. I'm acting like an auditor," I replied. "And since the accounts are currently under administrative review, I can't release any funds without secondary verification. So, where is the invoice?" The mask didn't just slip, it shattered. Her voice dropped an octave, losing the fake maternal warmth and replacing it with a sharp, jagged edge. "I know what you did, you selfish girl." Michael tried to pay his tuition and his card was declined. Your father went to move the property tax payment and the account was empty. "How dare you?" After everything we've done for you, we gave you a home, we gave you an education, and this is how you repay us? By stealing from your own blood? I didn't steal, I said calmly. I reclaimed. My education was paid for by a scholarship I earned while you were busy funding Michael's third attempt at freshman year. This house was kept out of foreclosure by my bonus checks. I haven't stolen a dime of your money because there was no your money left. It was all mine. If you don't return that money by tomorrow morning, don't bother coming back, she hissed. Your father and I have discussed it. If you're going to be this cold, this calculating, then you're no longer a part of this family. We are disowning you, Ashley. You'll be dead to us. Is that what you want? To be all alone in the world, just for the sake of a few numbers on a screen? I leaned back in my chair, looking at the Singapore confirmed notification on my laptop. I've been alone in that family for 10 years, Mom. The only difference is, now I'm not paying for the privilege. I ended the call before she could scream. It wasn't a tragedy. It was a contract termination. And as far as I was concerned, the exit interview was over. Victoria's office was a sanctuary of glass and cold logic, perched 40 floors above the city. The air in here always smelled like expensive espresso and the kind of high-end stationery that only people with zero debt use. She didn't look at me with pity when I walked in. Victoria had been my mentor for 6 years. She knew exactly what I was worth, and she knew exactly how much my family had been draining that value. She slid a folder across the mahogany desk. It wasn't a dismissal. It was an invitation. The regional head position in Singapore. 3,000 miles of ocean between me and the people who shared my DNA. I didn't even read the salary details. I didn't need to. I looked her in the eye and said yes before she could even finish her pitch about the cost of living adjustment. I wasn't just taking a job. I was accepting a tactical relocation. The next 72 hours were a blur of clinical efficiency. To move a life across the world at my level, you don't just pack a suitcase. You perform a total audit. I had to clear my domestic credit lines, close out local accounts, and run a final background check to ensure my security clearance would transfer to the Singapore branch. It was supposed to be a routine administrative task, a series of checkboxes on a spreadsheet. I was sitting in my living room at 2 a.m, the floor covered in half-packed boxes, when I opened the digital PDF of my comprehensive credit report. I scanned the lines of data, my eyes moving with the practiced speed of someone who looks at balance sheets for a living. Page 1. Clean. Page 2. Clean. Page 3. I stopped breathing for a second. There it was. An unsecured line of credit for $60,000. Opened 8 months ago at a boutique bank Michael used to frequent. I hadn't opened a new line of credit in years. I clicked the link to view the original digital application. My heart didn't race. My blood didn't boil. I just felt a cold, sharp click in my mind, like a key turning in a lock. I zoomed in on the signature at the bottom of the document. It was a decent attempt. It had the same slant as mine, the same sharp cross on the T. But Michael always had a tell. He curls the tail of his Y too high when he's nervous. He hadn't just been asking for my bonus. He had already stolen $60,000 in my name. He had used my social security number, my employment history, and my reputation to fund whatever hole he had dug for himself. He didn't just want a handout. He had committed identity theft. He had turned our relationship from a toxic family dynamic into a federal crime. I stared at the screen for a long time. The blue light reflected in my eyes, cold and unwavering. For years, I had treated Michael like a project, a debt that could eventually be settled if I just threw enough money at it. But you don't settle with a predator. You don't help someone who is willing to put you in a cage to keep themselves warm. I didn't call my mother. I didn't text Michael. I didn't even close the laptop. I simply picked up my phone and dialed my attorney. This wasn't a family dispute anymore. This was a felony, and in the world of high finance, we don't forgive forgeries. We prosecute them. The lobby of my condominium was a cathedral of brushed steel and silence until the heavy glass doors swung open and my family stormed in. They looked wildly out of place. My mother was still wearing her gardening shoes, her face a blotchy mask of desperate fury. My father looked smaller than I remembered, huddled in a windbreaker that seemed too big for his frame. And Michael was wearing the smug, practiced grin of a man who thought he still had one more card to play. "Ashley, thank God," Sarah started, her voice echoing off the marble walls, instantly pivoting back to her role as the grieving matriarch. "We've been calling you for hours. We drove 3 hours just to make you listen to reason. You can't just cut us off. You can't leave us with nothing." I didn't step toward them. I stayed behind the security desk's perimeter, my posture as rigid as the architecture around me. "I didn't leave you with nothing," I said, my voice cutting through her theatrics like a scalpel. "I left you with exactly what you've contributed to this family over the last decade. A zero balance." "You think you're so smart," Michael spat, stepping forward. He tried to loom over me, but the presence of the 2 uniformed security guards made him hesitate. "You think you can just run away to Singapore and hide? We'll sue you for every penny. That family trust belongs to all of us. You're just the manager, Ashley. You're not the owner." I looked at him, really looked at him. I didn't see a brother. I saw a liability. A bad investment that had finally reached its maturity date. "You're right about one thing, Michael. I am a manager, and a good manager knows when to terminate a predatory contract." I reached into my bag and pulled out a single, slim, manila folder. I didn't hand it to my mother. I didn't hand it to my father. I held it out directly to Michael. "What's this? A check?" Michael sneered, snatching it from my hand. He flipped it open, his eyes scanning the first page. I watched the color drain from his face in real time. It was a digital map of his own undoing. "That is a copy of the $60,000 credit application you filed in my name 8 months ago," I said, my voice cold and clinical, followed by a sworn affidavit from a handwriting expert confirming the forgery of my signature. "And at the very back, you'll find the contact information for Detective Miller at the Financial Crimes Division." The silence that followed was the most satisfying sound I'd ever heard. It was the sound of a decade of gaslighting coming to a screeching halt. My mother reached for the folder, her hands trembling. "Michael? What is she talking about? What did you do?" "He didn't just steal from a bank, Mom," I said, looking at her directly. "He stole from me. He used my life as collateral for his gambling. And you were going to let him do it again with my bonus." "Ashley, please." My father finally spoke, his voice cracking. "He's your brother. We can settle this. We don't need police. Just give us a chance to fix it." "The time for fixing things ended at 12:03 a.m. on Monday," I replied. I adjusted my watch, a gift to myself for a promotion they never bothered to celebrate. "I'm not your ATM. I'm not your safety net. And as of 5 minutes ago, I'm not your daughter. Security will show you out now. I have a plane to catch." I turned my back on them before they could utter another word. As I walked toward the elevators, I heard Michael's voice break into a panicked sob and my mother's frantic, hushed whispers. For the first time in 29 years, their noise didn't reach me. I was already gone. The cabin of the Boeing 787 was a pressurized sanctuary of white noise and dim blue LED lighting. I sat in seat 4A, the leather of the business class pod cool against my neck. Outside the small, thick window, the city lights of my old life were shrinking into a meaningless grid of amber sparks, eventually swallowed by the black expanse of the ocean. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone one last time before switching it to airplane mode. The screen was a battlefield of notifications. 70 missed calls from Sarah, 12 from David, a string of increasingly desperate, then vitriolic, texts from Michael. I didn't feel the sting I expected. I didn't feel the monster they were trying to project onto me. I felt light. I felt like a ship that had finally cut loose the rotting anchors that were dragging it into the silt. I scrolled to the top of the contact list and did something I should have done 5 years ago. I hit Select All on the Miller family folder and clicked Block. One tap, and the screaming stopped. The digital ghosts were exorcised. I leaned my head back and closed my eyes, letting the hum of the twin engines vibrate through my skull. In the silence of that cabin, I realized a truth that most people spend their entire lives trying to outrun. We are taught from birth that blood is the ultimate contract. We are told that family is everything, a phrase used as a weapon to keep the responsible ones tethered to the destructive ones. But blood isn't a contract, it's just biology. It's a shared genetic code, not a license for unlimited theft and emotional battery. When I was 24, I stayed up for 48 hours straight to finish Michael's senior thesis because he was too stressed to type. I thought I was being a good sister. Now, at 30,000 feet, I realized I was just an enabler in a transaction where I was the only currency. Letting go of blood ties isn't an act of hatred, it's an act of self-preservation. It is the moment you realize that the burning building you've been trying to save is actually a bonfire built out of your own dreams, and the people inside are the ones holding the matches. There is a specific, terrifying peace that comes when you stop trying to be the fixer for people who find comfort in being broken. It's the peace of realizing that you are finally, for the first time in your life, off the hook. I looked at the flight tracker on the screen in front of me. A tiny digital plane was inching across a vast, empty blue space. Destination, Singapore. Distance remaining, 8,400 miles. I adjusted my blanket, turned off the screen, and for the first time in 10 years, I fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. I wasn't the observant child anymore. I was just a woman on a plane, heading toward a life where my value would finally be measured by my character, not my bank balance. 6 months later, the humidity of Singapore has become a second skin, a warm embrace that replaced the cold air of my former life. I stood on the balcony of my apartment, watching the sun dip below the horizon of the South China Sea. The sky was a bruised purple and gold, the colors of a hard-won victory. My phone sat on the bistro table behind me. It hadn't made a sound in months. No frantic pings, no guilt-tripping texts, no demands for just a little more. In the silence, I had finally found my voice. I recently received a final email from my attorney back home. The state had moved forward with the charges against Michael for the $60,000 forgery. My parents had been forced to sell the family estate to cover his legal defense and the restitution. They were living in a 2-bedroom rental now. The news didn't spark joy, but it didn't spark regret either. It was simply the final line item in a long overdue audit. They had gambled with my life, and they had lost. There is a hard truth I had to learn. Some people don't want your love. They want your resources. They don't want a relationship. They want a transaction where they receive and you provide. For 29 years, I confused being needed with being loved. I thought that if I was the most valuable person in the room, I would be the most cherished. But respect isn't something you buy. Love isn't a debt you pay off. Real love doesn't keep a ledger, and it certainly doesn't forge your signature to keep itself afloat. I looked down at the city below a forest of lights and infinite possibilities. For the first time, my success belonged entirely to me. I wasn't an ATM for a brother who refused to grow up or a shield for parents who refused to see the truth. I was a woman who had finally learned that the most important investment you can ever make is the one you make in your own freedom. I picked up my glass and toasted the horizon. This wasn't a story about revenge. It was a story about accounting. And for the first time in my life, the balance was perfect. If you've ever had to choose yourself over a toxic cycle, type sovereign in the comments. Your story could be the strength someone else needs today. Don't forget to share this video and subscribe to join our community of survivors and architects of their own lives.